The controversy on readjusting investigative power between the prosecution and the police is intensifying here in Korea, with key figures in the prosecution and the police laying out big yet contradicting opinions on the matter. This after weeks of heated debate and violent clash at the National Assembly over the Judiciary reform bill. Today, we go in depth on what the controversy is all about and what lies ahead. But before we sit down with an expert, let's first take a look at our Oh Soo-young's report for some background information.
Korea's prosecution and police remain at loggerheads over a plan to redistribute the country's investigative powers. Chief Prosecutor Moon said Tuesday that legislative reform plans allowing the police to close initial investigations goes against democratic principles. He told reporters earlier in the day that the power to control, open and end investigations must be segregated in order to protect the rights of citizens. Meanwhile, the Commissioner General of the National Police Agency has indirectly supported the redistribution of power. Under the country's Criminal Procedure Act, only prosecutors have the authority to close investigations. The prosecution also has the exclusive right to indict suspects and, since 1962, the sole right to seek arrest warrants, making the police subject to the orders of prosecutors. Over the years, the asymmetrical system has led to concerns and criticism that such imbalance of power could lead to the obstruction of justice. Following a string of bribery and abuse of power scandals involving high-profile prosecutors, public skepticism towards the current investigative system has heightened in recent years. As part of a drive to root out corruption, the Moon Jae-in administration has pushed for the reassignment of investigative powers and the establishment of a special body to tackle corruption among senior government officials. However, efforts to fast-track legislation proposing these measures have been met with resistance from the prosecution, saying police authority would grow excessively. The police have dismissed these claims, saying the prosecution has the authority to intervene in any investigation. Also, the prosecution is particularly opposed to allowing the police to close initial cases, saying this could lead to cases being closed without sufficient investigation. Police authorities have again retorted that appeals can be made and that prosecutors can exercise their right to order reinvestigations. In what appears to be an attempt to find the middle ground, Cho-guk, a senior official at the presidential office, said Monday that the prosecution's concerns must be heeded. But he indicated that the fast-track decision on the reform must be respected and that efforts must be made to create an autonomous police and a special investigation body while upholding checks against excessive police expansion. A survey completed last week by Realmeter shows some 57% of some 9,000 Korean adults are in favor of rebalancing investigative powers. 31% opposed over concerns that the police could gain too much authority. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
For further discussion on the issue, Dr. Se-ryeon, law professor at Kyung Hee University, now joins us in the studio. Thank you for coming in today.
Good to be here.
So the controversy on readjusting investigative power between the prosecution and the police is intensifying here in Korea. But it's not the first time the issue has emerged to surface. Judiciary reform was one of President Moon Jae-in's campaign pledges, not to mention that this issue was quite a hot-button issue from quite a while ago. Could you first tell us how it all began?
Well, it has a pretty significant historical background to it. I mean, these two institutions, the police and the prosecutors, are powerful institutions to make the wrong right and to achieve justice. However, the power to make the case to the completion, namely investigative power, and the power to indictment does not really segregate very cleanly, because there's a room for oversight from the prosecutor's office in terms of how the investigation goes. And I think the historical background is that both institutions have a sad history of actually being very subservient to the powers at the time. So there's the mistrust level for both institutions are pretty high. So in terms of making that wrong right, to make it more professionalized, to make it more systematic in terms of check and balance, that discussion has been here, I think, about 25 years. I think that throughout the years, the key focus has been how to realign those two institutions' powers so that both will work together and be efficient. But the overwhelming kind of focus, including the President Moon's proposal, is to kind of reduce the power on the prosecutorial side and distribute the investigative power to the police. Now, I think that the big controversies that we're talking about is how to make that happen. I think that in principle, they agree that there has to be some distribution of power, but how would that work out in terms of in the language of the proposed bills?
So we could say this issue first began decades ago.
Right.
Currently, Korea's Criminal Procedure Act stipulates that police is subject to the prosecution's supervision in all cases. What's your take of this current law?
Well, if you look at other countries to do it, there are different ways of doing it depending on what kind of professionalization they have and what kind of check and balances in and out of their own institutions. So, for example, if you look at Anglo-American countries, England and America, they have a strong tradition of giving the police all the power of investigation and even the indictment. Now, England kind of veered off from that to give the power to the prosecutors for the power to indictment quite recently, actually, relatively recently in the 70s. United States, more so in terms of giving the police kind of complete power to investigate and indict. Prosecutors in the United States don't have a wholesale power to make the decision to indictment because they have to use the grand jury route to make a decision. So in that sense, Anglo-American countries kind of give the police that power that in Korea is a little bit foreign. Because Korea is part of the civil law country, civil law countries have different traditions. They traditionally had the prosecutors having all the powers and delegate the investigative duties to the police. So at this point, if you look at for example, Germany, they have the power to investigate in the police, but the prosecutors have the strong power to oversee.
Specifically, what the prosecution is against the most is empowering the police to independently close a case without the prosecution's approval. Prosecutor-General Moon said today that the empowerment would result in violation of citizens' basic rights. Why is the prosecution so up in arms about granting the police the power to independently close a case?
I think there are two views on that specific point. One is if you look at kind of general proposition that two heads are better than one, or taking a second look would more ensure that the errors could be corrected, probably he is right, because if the police makes mistakes about the investigation, then it's better to have a chance to go up the ladder and kind of raise the issue again in the prosecution's office. I think when he talks about the human rights of making sure that things go right, I think he is addressing that issue. But the second part of it is because of the historical backgrounds. There has been always a little bit of a turf fight between the two institutions. And the way it is set up now, the prosecution has a kind of a upper part, and they have the complete power to control the police, and police have no recourse but to follow the directions of the prosecution. So there's a kind of top-bottom relationship. In that sense, rather than saying that they don't want to give it up, but there is this turf fight aspect where they do not want to cede too much power to the police.
The National Police Agency, meanwhile, argues that there are enough check and balance measures included in the Judiciary reform bill, so they will remain in check of the prosecution. Could you tell us what those measures are?
Right. I think the answer is kind of a yes and no. There are notable exceptions to the sharing powers. First of all, prosecution already has a kind of exclusive jurisdiction for some of the cases, like when it has to do with the elections, the civil servants, and all those. They have their own domain at this point. And also, even when the police close the case and refuse to indict, there are many cases where the claimant can raise it up again to the prosecutor's office. So those exceptions do exist, but at this point, I think it's an overstatement to say that all the safeguards are there, but it's also an overstatement that those kind of the formulation that the present bill has closed all the loopholes.
So you don't think the measures are sufficient to keep the police in check at all times?
Right. At this point, the bill is lacking in details, but I wouldn't see that as a kind of a fatal flaw, because they're in a fast-track process of introducing the bill. That does not mean that the bill as is written has passed. They have almost a year to discuss and kind of look at different dynamics and different loopholes to plug the holes. So at this point, they can raise a lot of the objections and concerns. I think it's helpful, but we do have a sufficient amount of time to address those.
Senior Presidential Secretary for Civil Affairs Cho Guk, as we've seen in our Oh Seung's report, has said that Prosecutor-General Moon's concerns must also be taken into account. Can we say that Cho's statement reflects the government's official stance?
Yeah, I think he's acknowledging the fact that the bill as it is may be insufficient in some of the details. And I think it's perfectly okay to say that because, like I said, there's about 330 days to look at the bill and make some adjustments in the National Assembly. But I think his adamant in that saying is that we do need the legal reform, and the reduction of power on the prosecutorial side will go ahead.
National survey results are also rolling out on the matter. According to a survey conducted by Real Meter, 57.3% of the respondents said they support the readjustment of investigative rights, while 30.9% said they oppose. How do you analyze this survey result?
Well, both sides are pretty significant numbers, and I think it kind of validates the point where both institutions have a checkered history of earning mistrust from people because of being subservient to whoever is in the power. And you can even point to recent cases where, in a Burning Sun case, which is a case where the police is criticized as not getting the investigation preliminarily done thoroughly. And also, it was mentioned that some, heavyweights in the prosecutor's office is involved. I mean, those are all allegations, but it just reflects the people's little bit of, those opinions that those institutions might not be very clean in those cases. So, in that sense, I think the people's opinion is that we oppose the situation where any one institution gets too powerful, and there has to be some sharing of the power, but exactly how it should be shared, probably it has to be going through some experts' massaging of the details.
Now, as a law professor, what are your hopes and fears of the judiciary reform?
Right. I think that this is a good opportunity to raise the issue. I mean, I mentioned about the mistrust that those institutions have, but those are important institutions. So in that sense, we need to see that check and balance system is robust, and it has to go through some process where the police especially becomes professionalized. I think that it's wrong to say that the police cannot be trusted because if they have too much power, they will abuse power at this point. I think there are enough cases or the examples of safeguards that we can use. For example, in the U.S., the police goes through, after each case, internal affairs. If anything suspicious comes up, they'll get involved and they are pretty thorough about it. So in that sense, we can employ or deploy a lot of different safeguards to make sure that professionalization and sharing the power does not mean that the more power to the police to a point where they will be abusing the power.
All right, Dr. Song, thank you as always for your insights tonight.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you right back here, same time tomorrow.